Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Year of Jacob of Serugh, an online series of lectures on the writings and theology of the Bishop of Batnan to celebrate the 15th anniversary of his death. I greet you from Washington, D.C. I am Armando El-Khoury. Robert Kitchen, the co-organizer of the Year of Jacob of Serugh, and I are glad that you are able to join us on Zoom today to celebrate Jacob. We also greet and welcome our live viewers on the YouTube channel of the Maronite Eparchy of Los Angeles and on Urho The Way. Before I pass the mic to Robert, who will give homage to Paul Peters and Stephen Ring, who have recently passed away, I want to thank our guest speaker, Muriel Dubier, for her paper entitled Jacob of Serugh in His Time, a Preacher in Late Antique Mesopotamia. And also would like to thank Jeff Wicks, who agreed to present our speaker. And gratitude is also due to my bishop, His Excellency Elias Zaidan, for sponsoring this online conference. The logistics of managing this talk. You may direct your questions to today's speaker only at the end of her talk. To do so, click on the reactions icon under the video feed. When the small pop-up window opens up, click on raise hand. I will call on you in the order I see on my screen, and I will request that you unmute yourself. Once unmuted, you may ask your question. Thank you again for joining us. And here is Robert Kitchen.
Okay. Last time we met, we had to remember two of our colleagues who had passed away in the past few weeks. We did not expect that we'd have to do this again, but it is fitting that we recognize people who have been part of our community. In the past few weeks, Stephen Ring passed away quite suddenly and unexpectedly. He was originally an electronic and communications engineer, but somewhere in the late 90s, he got a hold of Syriac and started studying it, particularly in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He finally finished and defended his thesis, The Post-5th Century Trajectory of the Syriac Diatessaron and Perspectives on the Origins of the Diatessaron, just shortly before his death. He was part of and he's participated in all three of our lectures up to this point. And so we are sad to lose him and for his work, particularly on the Syriac sections of the Diatessaron. Paul Peters is also quite unexpectedly passed away in Leuven, Belgium. He was a member of the founding family of Peters Publishing, and indeed was the executive director. He was not a scholar per se, but anyone in Syriac who attended really any one of the major conferences, the Society of Biblical Literature, the Oxford Patristics, Symposium Syriacum, and many others would remember meeting and talking with him. He was always friendly, and he was maybe not rare, but he was definitely distinguished by his support and encouragement of the Syriac field faithfully throughout these years. May indeed both of them rest in peace, and we remember their contributions gratefully. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob. It is now my great honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Muriel Dubier. Professor Dubier is Professor of Eastern Christian Studies at École Pratique des Hautes Études at the Sorbonne, a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France. She's held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, and is part of an IRIS grant for the program Scripte, Histoire et Pratique de l'écrit. Professor Debier is engaged in a wide range of editing activities. She's the co-founder and director of the series Bibliothèque de l'Orient Chrétien, as well as the co-founder and director of the series Études Syriaques. Professor Debier is most well known for her publications, which are not only numerous, but also display a depth of historical learning, imagination, insight, and erudition. Setting aside her many articles and edited books, I will merely highlight 2 of her 3 monographs. Her second book, L'écriture de l'histoire in Syriaque, was published with Brill in 2015. This book has been foundational in understanding historiography from a uniquely Syriac perspective. Through the lens of Syriac historiographical narratives and narrators, the work engages questions about Syriac literary history writ large, and comparatively, the methods of writing history in the pre-modern period. Her third and most recent book, Le Monde Syriaque, co-authored with François Briquel-Chatonnet, was published in 2018 and is currently being translated into English for publication with Yale University Press. This book, drawing on literary text as well as material history, offers an indispensable guide to the Syriac tradition as it emerged chronologically from the 2nd to the 13th century and geographically from Byzantium to India and China. With all of this in mind, it is our great honor today to have Professor Debier turn her attention to Jacob of Serugh in his time, a preacher in late antique Mesopotamia. Professor Debier, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your detailed and duly positive introduction. I would like to thank the organizers for this series of conferences that celebrate the year of Jacob of Serugh and for inviting me, although I'm a newcomer in Jacobean studies. This celebration comes aptly after the revelation of 160 new homilies recently published by Roger Akras and Imad Siriani, to whom we are greatly indebted for making available a considerable addition to the existing corpus that we have just started to assess. I will share the screen in order to show you the edition. Oh, sorry. Please. Not the screen I wanted, sorry. Here it is. Yes, supposed to go to the next slide. It's not the case. Never mind. I wanted to show you the edition and to show you what a manuscript of Jacob's homilies actually look like. Had Jacob written in Greek or Latin and had been a member of a Catholic or Orthodox churches, that edition would have made the headlines of newspapers, well, of the cultural pages of some newspapers. But this event remained confined to the happy few who are aware of Jacob's artful poetry and exegetical skills. So let us rejoice then of his confidential breakthrough. Pending the awaited edition of Jacob's biography, copied in the manuscript of Mardin, that is supposed to be the only true biography according to our fathers, we have to rely on notices and panegyrics. They agree in presenting in a hagiographic mode the exceptional gift of Jacob as a preacher and writer that the Holy Spirit supposedly bestowed upon him. I quote from one of his short biographies what I found a significant passage for understanding what image of Jacob was construed in these memorial hagiographies. At the young age of 3, Jacob escaped his mother's arms and walked to the sanctuary under the gaze of the whole congregation. I quote, "He stretched out his hands and drank 3 handfuls, like Ezekiel eating from the scroll. And from that moment, the Spirit of the Lord alighted upon him, and he began to utter discourse that was out of the norm." This passage tells us in the form of a typical hagiographic tale how Jacob stood as an intermediary between God and the faithful, here lay people in the church, both part of the congregation and apart from it, in his role as an instrument for words and sounds from above, within, and around. It stresses his gift from a young age and his unique and outstanding position as a preacher. This passage also establishes a link between the written, Ezekiel's scroll, and the spoken word, an articulation to which I will come back later. This hagiographic expression of Jacob's role resounds with what the ancient chronicles also say. It constitutes the collective memory of Jacob that was transmitted through time until today, reenacted orally in the liturgy, based on Boa Rosso, woven from his memory, and visible in the beautiful and mammoth manuscripts that contains his works. And that is the image that you are not seeing right now, but that I wanted to show you. It is on Jacob as a preacher that I would like to focus today from a historical as well as a more exegetical point of view. I would like first to gather what information we have about his training and his activity as a preacher against the background of contemporary history. The proemia of his memory, in turn, give a lyric interpretation of the way Jacob himself envisioned his role as a preacher. They also say something about his craftsmanship and how we can understand the articulation of the written and the spoken word with and without a capital. Jacob's reputation in his own time far exceeds what was his official position. He was most of his life a mere periodotes, an ecclesiastical visitor, meaning that he was under the authority of a bishop, probably the Bishop of Serugh, to whom he ultimately succeeded at a late age. The visitors had no authority but that from the bishop, who sent them to monasteries or small cities and villages in the countryside. Jacob does not seem to have had even the rank of chorepiscopos or bishop of a chora in the countryside. Since the 4th century, chorepiscopoi tended to lose their independence and acted as periodotes, but still they had a superior rank. Periodotes came third in the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the bishoprics. In Syria, fewer chorepiscopoi than periodotes are attested in the inscriptions. And the Canon 57 of the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century attests that periodotes replaced chorepiscopoi in the villages, although chorepiscopoi did not disappear. The periodotes played an important role in the life of the church outside the cathedral cities, as the mentioned begots in mosaic pavements of rural churches exemplify. Periodotes were clerics. Some were not even priests, assisting the bishop of a city in his administration of the church in his diocese. Yet, Jacob was far more famous than the bishop of Serugh, on whom he depended. He became so well known that he was even mentioned in Chronicle, whereas the name of the bishop or bishops to whom he was attached did not make its way to posterity. We know that Severus Sebokht in the 7th century wrote a letter to a Herodotus, Yonan, about Aristotelic philosophy, but no other Herodotus than Jacob is known for his writings. He was an authoritative figure in his own right, although he did not have, until very late in his life, a position of authority in the church. The artistry of his homilies explain, of course, why he became so famous, but he was also more present in the life of a local church than most bishops, since he toured the diocese of Serugh. We should thus picture him as an itinerant monk and priest who preached in front of different audiences according to where he was sent by his bishop. And contrary to bishops who preached mostly in the city of their seat, we have little information about the places where Jacob preached, except for the 3 years he spent as bishop of Serugh. It means that the intertextuality in his Mimre, weaving echoes between them, was probably lost to his audiences, which were not the same each time he preached. They were more likely the result of his own mode of composition based on memory and artful combination of formulaic phraseology that Manolis Papoutskakis has identified as one of Jacob's poetic tools. Susan Harvey has drawn a vivid picture of what we can glean from his Mimre about his audience. Jacob not only delivered speeches on the Bible, the feasts of the church, or the holy men, but he also made Mimre about local life and events. He wrote about the locusts that ravaged crops, just as Severus of Antioch, who wrote poems on them. Like the poems attributed to Ephraim, he composed Mimre of praise at the table, some probably set during the banquets after the harvest of crops or fruit, from what we can gather from the content. He wrote also against the spectacles of the theater that the faithful attended, and he spoke during saints' commemorations. He might even have traveled to the monastery of Simeon the Stylite and made there his speech on Simeon, even mentioned, I quote, "Let us return then to the pillar, which is right here," is a reference to the actual pillar and not just a rhetorical posture. But his influence went even far beyond the boundaries of his jurisdiction and his official position. It reached wide and far. We have kept only 43 letters from him, which is not much in comparison with the number of Mimre, but they depict how his network extended from individuals like monks and nuns, but also counts, to heads and communities of monasteries or bishops, not only in northern Mesopotamia, but all the way to Sinai and to Najran. Philippe Fornes highlighted in his book the historical context that these letters provide for the engagement of Jacob in Christological debates and preaching. The letters and Mimre also present a unique insight of Jacob's involvement in the context of Roman-Persian relations, not only during wars, but also in the more ordinary basis of the life of the churches. During the Anastasian War, he wrote a letter to the bishop or to a priest of Edessa, we do not know because the heading of the letter is lost, reminding him of God's unreachable promise to protect Abgar's city and exhorting him to encourage the inhabitants who stayed in spite of the Persian threats. He also wrote 2 Mimre on the capture of Amida at a time when the city was without a bishop, since he died at the beginning of the war. But aside from these special circumstances, Jacob also answers the letter of Orthodox Christians of Arzun, a stronghold in Persia. He says that the letter was brought to him secretly by a priest who crossed the border like a merchant and brought the news of the attempts to Nestorianize the Orthodox community there. Jacob asserts that all the seats in the Roman Empire openly condemned Nestorius, and he sends an Orthodox profession of faith to his addresses. He also speaks about the Mariology of Nestorius in his discussion of the hypostasis of Christ. So several of Jacob's writings actually show the importance of Mariological questions in the controversies with the Diophysites in Iran. The letter to the Blessed of Arzun, of which I just spoke, and also the letter to the Bishop of Dara, another stronghold at the border of the Roman Empire, fortified by Anastasius in 505, which gives a terminus postquem for his letter, in which Jacob urges the bishop to build a spiritual wall for his flock, similar to the physical walls against the Persian enemies, because of the vicinity of the Nestorians. And he sends him, as a weapon, a beautiful Mariological development on the Virgin as a sealed door. Mariology features here too as a major subject of discussion. The Mimro on the Dormition of the Virgin is another instance of those discussions with the Nestorians. It is the only one for which we have a precise setting. The title of this Mimro says that it is the 81st festal homily of Jacob and is about the departure and burial of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, highlighting thus the title that was the contentious issue with the Nestorians. It goes on saying that Jacob spoke this Mimro when there was an inquiry about the Dormition during a synod meeting in the church of Serugh the martyr in the city of Nisibis on a Wednesday, the 14th of Av. This was in fact the date of the celebration of the Feast of the Dormition, as the content of the Mimro shows. I'm afraid you will have to wait for Charles Naffa to finish his PhD on the 6 books of Life of the Virgin to know more about the Dormition and its celebration. I will not elaborate on this topic here. But the information provided by this title is both tantalizing and frustrating, since the year of the event is not mentioned, neither the exact circumstances. Nonetheless, this short introduction gives interesting information. It informs us about the name of a church in Nisibis dedicated to Kyriakos, or martyr, better known as Judas Kyriakos. It informs us about the celebration of the Dormition, the 14th of Av. And of course, we would like to know more about this synod in the Persian Empire, one of the local ones that took place every 2 years in each province, and not one of the great councils of the church. We have to keep in mind that the final years of the 5th century saw the influence of Barsoma of Nisibis, who was a propagandist of Diophysite Christology in the Persian Empire, and may have founded the school of Nisibis. The city was thus the hotbed of Diophysite Christology at the time of Jacob. And it was during this synod that Jacob preached a distinctly Miaphysite view of the departure of the Virgin as a kind of counter-propaganda. Since he delivered his Mimro in a church of the city, we should assume that it was a church in the hands of a Miaphysite congregation, which is also an important information. And it mentions strikingly that Jacob spoke in Nisibis. Jacob mentioned in his letter to the Christian of Arzun that priest Lazarus overcame dangers and braved the fear of the enemies in order to deliver the letter secretly. Should we suppose that the same was true for Jacob? Did he exaggerate the dangers for passing his letter to the Roman Empire? Or did he get safe conduct for as an ecclesiastical figure in order to cross the border? Was it different in Nisibis because it was one of the official markets and crossing point on the border? We have no means to answer this question. All we can suggest is that since there was no bishop for the Orthodox in Nisibis, Jacob went as an itinerant authority coming from the nearby region of Edessa. With a terminus antequem in 521, when Jacob died, this text poses more problems than it gives answers, yet it sheds some light on the practical conditions of the controversies across the Roman-Persian border. This text offers also a few glimpses of the frustrating in their elusiveness of Jacob's engagement in the Christological controversies with the Nestorians across the border, especially it gives information about the place of Mariological arguments in the discussions dealing with Christ's natures. It should not come as a surprise, but we generally tend to downplay this aspect when we deal with Christological issues. The matter was not confined to the aftermath of the Council of Ephesus. It is significant, for instance, that when the school of the Persians in Edessa was closed because of its Diophysite leaning, Simeon of Beit Arsham, a Miaphysite known as the Persian debater, says in his letter that it was uprooted and in its place, a temple in the name of Our Lady Mary the Theotokos was built. I would like to turn now to the question of Christological discussions from another angle, that of Jacob's education and formation. I want to add to the picture information that has been well known and yet has not fully been considered so far when one comes to the intellectual life in Edessa, the use of languages or questions of ethnic and religious identities, or when discussing Marseille, Jacob, and Philoxenus, who taught or studied there. You all know the passage in the letter to the monks of Morbassus, in which Jacob says that 45 years ago, I quote, when I was studying the readings of the divine scriptures in the city of Edessa, and at the very time the books of the wicked Diodor were being translated from Greek into Syriac, and there was in the city a school of the Persians who held the teaching of the foolish Diodor with much love. And by that school, all the East was harmed. The school, by the diligence of him who is worthy of good memory, Morkura, Bishop of Edessa, and by the command of the faithful Emperor Zeno, was uprooted from the city. Then, at the same time that those wicked books were being translated from Greek to Syriac, I was as a child who is in need of learning. I came across one of these books of Diodor, and I found it full of all ambiguities and all thoughts which are quite far from the truth. That would have taken place in the 460s or 470s, about the time when Philoxenus came to Edessa and Marseille left and went to Nisibis. The school was closed in 489. It is usually assumed that in spite of this clear condemnation of the works of the Antiochian writers, Jacob attended that school and perhaps even attended Marseille's classes. He speaks, however, of the school in this passage in a distant way, not as if he had been part of it. And that may well be the case if we remember that 3 schools actually existed in Edessa in the mid-5th century, as the Acts of the robust Synod of Ephesus state. The Synod took place in 449. The Acts describe the city's various complaints against Ibas and mention that one of the various acclamations made against him was signed by citizens from the city of Edessa. I quote the Acts. They said they subscribed to it. All the clergy and the heads of monasteries, monks and Nicaea, worthies and citizens and Romans, and the schools of the Armenians, of the Persians and of the Syrians, and the artisans and the whole city. Adam Becker, in his book, The Fear of God, has pieced together all the available information about the schools, yet the existence of these 3 schools is seldom acknowledged in other studies. It is true that we know next to nothing about the other 2 schools, but their existence is meaningful in itself. We can guess that they were meant to accommodate students of other nations and languages. The existence of a school of the Otoye in Amida, which is mentioned by John of Ephesus, because it was destroyed by the Persians during the siege of a city in 502-503, backed by a monastery of the Otoye. The Otoye came from the province of Anziten, a region east of Amida at the border with Armenia. seems to confirm that these schools were meant for nationals from other regions or countries. If we extrapolate from what we know from the canons of the School of Nisibis, they probably worked as some sorts of boarding schools for students coming from far away, backed, of course, by monasteries where they would stay. Just as in Paris in the Middle Ages, there were, for example, the College of the Irish or the College of the Scots for those who came to study at the Sorbonne. Narcisse taught at the School of the Persians, and Philoxenus might have studied there too, since he came from Persia, from the region of Bedgarmai. But in all likelihood, Jacob attended the School of the Serugh. The way he speaks of a School of the Persians points in the same direction. It is neither the School of the Persians, as if it were the only one, neither our school. The School of the Armenians is almost never mentioned in the studies about the Armenians who studied in Syrian regions. And I will not discuss that here because it's not the place. But the existence of a school is very important for the relations between Armenian and Syrians at that time. Apart from the fact that the language of teaching in the schools was probably Syriac, we do not know anything about the curriculum. We know from Jacob's works that he read Ephraim and wrote a memo on him, on his life. He read Theodore of Mopsuestia too, as the images of divine pedagogy he uses exemplify, and I will shortly turn to that. Yet he makes a different use of Theodore than Narcisse, for instance. The similarities and differences between Jacob and Narcisse have been often noted, and more comparative work is yet to be done, keeping in mind the possible different training in those two schools, and yet a common access to the books available in the Desa. Each student, for instance, of each school had access to the books kept, copied, and studied in the other schools. From what Philoxenus as well as Jacob say, they both read the text of the Antiochian father only to reject them and put the blame on their young age. If the Antiochians were not part of the curriculum of the School of the Serugh, as is likely, Jacob managed to get hold of them anyway. Manuscripts were rare, and he read them because they were available in the city at that time for translation. That means that he borrowed them from a fellow student or a teacher, perhaps from the School of the Persians. The example of Patriarch Timotheus, much later on, an East Syrian who tried to obtain books from Marmatai, a Syrian Orthodox monastery, shows, however, that it was not always successful and easy. But since the manuscript of the Pshita, dated 599, bears a colophon saying that it was collated on a manuscript of the book of the School of the Armenians, we can infer that the books kept in the school were used by outsiders. There's not much more that we can say about the three schools, since the School of the Persians was the only one that received some light because of its problematic theological position. But their existence suggests a more complex picture than the one generally envisioned. It suggests a national or ethnic level, in addition to the confessional one. Jacob's own testimony also allows the possibility of a more flexible exchange of books and ideas than the controversies and condemnations entail. As we will see now, Jacob had much in common with Theodore from Mopsuestia, the interpreter par excellence and the column of the Church of the East, in his conception of man as God's image and of divine pedagogy. But it doesn't mean that Jacob had to learn about Theodore as a student at the School of the Persians. I would like to turn in this final part to the proemia of Jacob's memory that display his own understanding of his role as a preacher and his conception of divine pedagogy, which he shares with the Antiochian fathers and yet conceptualizes differently. The Proemia are striking by their distinctiveness, beauty, and strength. They reveal a theology of the word, logos, melto, that encapsulate Jacob's activity as a preacher, associating the body and the intellect. They play with a common idea set in different verbal garments that are adapted to the subject of each mimro, and they contain many theological, rhetorical formulas that can be traced as echoes in the various Proemia. As Geoffrey suggested last time, they may be understood as part of a liturgical ritual, as a way of providing the audience with words they were familiar with. And they function indeed as a musical introduction that captures the audience's attention. Jacob was trained as a Christian writer and does not ignore any of the means of a captatio benevolentiae. In the middle of the liturgy, as Susan Harvey pointed out, after the liturgy of the word and before the liturgy of the faithful, Jacob had to gather attention to the bema on which he stood and concentrate attention to his words. Like the words once upon a time opened the door of fairy tales, similarly, Jacob's invocations opened the door of the mimro and the door to God, an image that he employs also frequently when invoking God's inspiration. The Proemia are replete with mention of the word with and without capital again. The word with capital, Christ, descended on earth, and the words that Jacob demands from God for his audience, and words of his audience giving praises in return. The words are associated with sound and even music, implying the physical dimension of the senses. Jacob considered the senses to be 10, the 5 external senses, which are the door to the 5 internal ones. The sense of hearing plays a particular role. Through the ear, Eve was fooled by the words of a serpent, and through the ear, Mary conceived the word Christ. The physical dimension is fully involved in the relation between human beings and God in Jacob's view. The mirror on the dormition of a virgin displays a rich image of a mingling of the sense of hearing and the word. As a tribute to Mary Hansberry, who has recently left us, I will quote Jacob from her translation that she gathered in a nice little booklet full of treasures. I quote, "Lord of all, let my heart be stirred up by you for your glory, for because of you, whoever is eager is able to speak to you. My Lord, generate for me sounds and words, even music, that my mouth may speak about you profusely. My tongue will be your pen, a scribe full of wisdom, and with it will lovingly show forth your discourse to be heard." And later he says, "Son, who firmly fixed 10 mortal senses in the mortal body, stay my thoughts and bring them to the place of your Father." Through the image of the flute, by which Jacob was later known as the flute of the Spirit, of the harp that God plays with his fingers, Jacob expresses a metaphysic that is Aristotelian in essence. God is the principle that moves the world without moving himself. Jacob, as a human microcosm, experiences as a preacher the impulse that God through the Spirit creates in him. He presents himself as an instrument, an image that is also underlying the Odes of Solomon. Receiving inspiration both intellectually and physically as a poet, through whom the poem unveils itself, as a recipient of divine inspiration, as an intermediary between God and human beings, interpreting both scriptures and nature, as a vessel for emotions, transcribing the emotions of the faithful. The image of a poem speaking for him cannot but remind us of modern semiotics theories about the generation of text. I quote from the Memo on the Nativity of our Redeemer. I am giving the harp of my words to you, and let me borrow your finger. By the impulse of the Spirit, let my mind bring forth the homily of your praise, because I am not capable of your homily. Please speak through me. I am the flute when your word is breath, and your story is the voice. Please take control of it, and by your means, may we sing to you using what is your own. Since your first birth is concealed even from the watchers, make me worthy to sing out from the latter one, from the daughter of David. This passage concentrates several elements of Jacob's thought that we find scattered in most of his poemia. Jacob shares here with Ephraim the idea that God is ontologically separated from humanity and is concealed in silence. Even the spiritual beings cannot speak about him. With Theodore of Moxuestia and the Antiochian school, he shares the idea that God made himself known through man, created as his image. The importance of this idea of image is central in Jacob's thought. It is because man is the image of God that it is possible to know God. As for Ephraim, nature and scriptures are the bridges between God, who is unknowable, and man's intellect. For Jacob, nature is not as important as it is for Ephraim. But the story told by God's dispensation is for him the condition for bridging, at least partially, the ontological cast. He cannot speak about Christ's son. He cannot speak about Christ, Son of God, his first birth, but he can speak of his second birth, when Christ mingled with nature, when, I quote, you were hidden in your father, and he revealed you in Adam. When he created him, he depicted in him the likeness of your bodily existence and your revelation. It is the creation of man in God's image and the incarnation that brought God unto man, that enables humans to speak about God. And that is why it is in memory about Christ's nativity and about the Virgin that this idea is most powerfully evoked by Jacob. I quote again from the Memo on Tamar. From your father, the whole of your story has come close to us, and love has united you in lineage with us, that we may sing praises to you. You became one of us while you are our Lord, and anyone who seeks to speak your story is entitled to do so. In this poem of the Memo on Nativity, Jacob explains how the incarnation of the Word enabled human beings to speak words about the divinity, bridging somehow the gap between the divine and human beings through words. And the metaphysic of the Logos, Melto, underlines this conception. I quote, awake with discernment, intelligence, in order to speak. For in the dust, this is a way of speaking about Adam. For in the dust, he imprisoned his word in order to convert it. I did not dare assent to the essence that is invisible to all. I composed in an Adamic way this treaty full of wonder. This is from the Proemion of the second Memo about creation. The word imprisoned in dust is a powerful image for understanding the depth of Jacob's conception. The word of the homily is possible because from the beginning, God imbued it into Adam, both corporal and spiritual, mortal and immortal, and renewed it when he sent his own word, Christ, to partake of humanity. God is thus the first speaker and spoke in the scriptures to Moses, the scribe, and through Jacob, who wrote a memo about God. He is also the first teacher that teaches humanity a lesson. in the Mimro on the Tower of Babel, the image is that of a schoolmaster who strikes the students, humanity, whom he instructs, an image that Jacob probably got from his own school experience. To stay in this more concrete image of teaching, Jacob always urges his audience to find the rose in the middle of the thorns, honey in bitterness, to be attentive to the sweetness of teaching in his memory, as well as in the Bible, where even the terrible story of Tamar brings fruit. And so he tries to convince his audience of the fruitfulness of the Mimro. The powerful conception of the word as the incorporated divine intelligence in human beings as images of God should help us assess better the high conception of preaching and teaching that was Jacob's. God made himself known to humanity through his story, and this is a word that Jacob uses a lot, sharbo, as told in the Bible, as well as through the story of a virgin or the story of a saint. That story is made of symbols to decipher and words that anyone, and Jacob in the first place, can use to retell it and interpret it. In conclusion, these invocations probably worked too as a way of weaving together the several threads of his position as a preacher. Physically, since he stood on the bema at the crossroads of a sanctuary and the nave where the faithful were gathered, the words of the Mimro tied together the vertical and horizontal dimensions between God and the preacher and his audience. Symbolically, since he delivered his speech between the liturgy of the word and the communion, he invokes the word of God that enables the Mimro between the story of God spoken in the Bible and the story of Christ in his economy. In a more practical way, these invocations that Jacob adapts with artistic lyricism to the subject of each Mimro worked as a kind of warming up for him while he pulled together the strings of a Mimro from God to the preacher and from the preacher to the audience with a return on high to praises and songs. A more in-depth analysis of the verses would show how the formulaic phraseology Jacob used were useful in order for him to enter in the creative process of a Mimro as words that he could easily piece together from memory, especially since some of his memory at least were probably extemporized. We may think of them as ritual compositions from a treasure chest of words to take over an image that Jacob himself uses when he asks God to give him words from the treasure of his scripture or from nature. More research is needed on the importance of the story and the word in Jacob's creation process, but I will stop here in order that you do not die of boredom and restlessness in front of your screen, especially since I'm afraid that you may not find even the tiniest of rosebuds from my ugly talk, to speak in Jacobean terms. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I love the image that he gives, that he is an instrument and God uses him to play his music, and how he sees himself as God's spokesperson, and God imbued in him that gift, and he's using it for preaching. Does he see himself as such because he's an ordained minister, do you think? Or does he see himself as such, as somebody whom God can speak through because he's a Christian? In your opinion, what do you think?
It's probably because he is a human being, and because from the very beginning, during the act of creation of man itself, God actually, as the image of of the dust shows imbued men, human beings, with a word, and so it enables Jacob to not only ask for words, but also find words in himself, and words as means of understanding God, who is otherwise unknowable. So it has very powerful meaning for him.
Okay, thank you very much.
To have access to the intellect with a capital, to God himself.
Thank you. We open it now for questions. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask question, please click on the reactions icon and the video feed, and then click on raise hand, and I will call on you in the order I see on my screen. I would request that you unmute yourself, and once you are unmuted, you may ask your question. Jeff.
Thank you, Muriel, for this really wonderful, interesting talk. So much detail and insight, situating Jacob in so many different contexts. First, a comment, and then a question. The comment, I really appreciated how you stressed when Jacob was a periodevtes, how it was this combination of a lack of ecclesiastical authority because he was pretty low on the totem pole and just had to do whatever the bishop kind of told him to do, but that also afforded a close connection with people that a bishop might not have had. And I'd never really thought about that tension as formative for that office. So I really appreciate that. The question I have, it's admittedly kind of vague, so forgive me. I'm really struck both with the stuff I was thinking about last month and what you've brought up here about this this tension between traditionality and originality in Jacob. On the one hand, he seems so formed by other things, some that we can see. For example, you highlighted Theodore's emphasis on education, which clearly is formative for Jacob. And then there are formative influences that we can't see, such as his proemia. Clearly, he's learned something somewhere, how to build these proemia, because it is so formulaic. And I guess my question is, do you think, and I'm taking it for granted that Jacob is kind of unique, like his proemia are very different from Narsai's proemia. I think, I could be wrong. Do you think Jacob is just truly unique in the way he has taken some kind of formation, which is available to a lot of people, and developed it into a really unique, let's say, piece of art, which is the Jacobean Mimra? Or do you think he's a representative of a tradition that we don't have as much evidence of? Do you think somewhere there were people that composed these long ornate proemia and we just have Jacob's? I guess, yeah, how representative of a tradition is Jacob, and how much is he generally taking these formative influences but developing them into something new? Sorry, that's kind of a huge, ambiguous question, but something your talk made me think of. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I would think of Jacob as quite unique. We do not have the same type of proemia as Jacob, and probably because of the way he envisions his work, or his position more precisely, as a preacher. So the question of inspiration is central to him. He is both a preacher and a poet. And so I'm not sure that in Greek or Latin traditions, for instance, we will have the same type of proemia. But even in Syriac, although of course the culture was common, probably part of the education, Narsai, as Jacob and Philoxenus probably learned how to write memory in schools, just as writers in ancient times learned how to write discourses. So there probably was a Christian training in those three schools in Edessa as elsewhere in the monasteries, because of course we had to preach a lot each week, several times a week. And so they probably learned at school, but also trained on the spot, sometimes writing entirely memory, sometimes having just a kind of canvas on which they would extemporize, or some of them maybe just entirely made on the spot. And so Jacob probably had well, he had a knowledge of the Bible, which he perhaps knew by heart. I met a monk in Lebanon who knew the Bible by heart, and not only that, but he memorized the chapters and verses of the passages during the offices. And so it was quicker to ask him for a reference when we were working on Serugh manuscripts than going to an online tool. And so I find it really interesting because that is nowadays. And so at the time when people didn't have many books, they would, of course, learn by heart a lot. And we know that from a number of Serugh texts. And so probably Jacob did the same. He knew probably the Bible almost by heart, as well as maybe Ephraim's works. And so he both used formulaic expressions that were easy to use in the context of the hexameter of his memory, but at the same time, he uses them differently each time. And it's the same for the images coming from the Bible. He loves some passages more than others, but in the different memory, he doesn't use those passages the same way. He adapts them to the context. And he has different interpretations in the different memory. So he has his own intertextual composition, which makes him quite unique. And that is true also for the poemia, as well as the memory as such. And so I'm not sure that he's representative of a tradition. He is in the sense that he was trained like other speakers, other clerics. He knew the Bible like most of the faithful, and probably better, of course. He read a number of commentaries and probably knew some of them by heart. And especially he knew, he read and knew Ephraim, because you can see how his own poetry is indebted to Ephraim's one. But at the same time, he did something quite unique. And the number of his memory, as well as the size and the content, is not comparable to any other writer in the Serugh tradition, I think. Even if he has a lot in common with Narsai also, for instance.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Philip?
Yes, thank you, Muriel, so much for your talk. I learned quite a lot from this, and I'm excited to look at these texts with fresh eyes now. I have two questions. One's more specific and one's more general. The first is, I was really happy that you engaged this homily on the Dormition. I've been puzzled a bit myself by the title that's given to it in the manuscript, this 81st Festal Mimra, and where that could possibly come from. And so my more specific question to that, Memra, is whether, as you read through it, if you saw signs that could confirm this context that's given in the title. I tend to be skeptical of these. In other cases, I think there's one or two, Jacob's first or last homily, where I'm a bit more skeptical, but this one's so specific that I don't know why else they would say this particular context. So that's my more specific question. Perhaps I'll leave it there for a moment.
Yeah, it's difficult to know what to think about this introduction, because as you say, it's very specific. But at the same time, it's not surprising if it really happened, but it was, written down. The context is likely, because as I said, Mariology was an important issue in the discussions with the Nestorians. And so the idea that a Miaphysite was invited by a Miaphysite congregation in Nisibis to give a talk at a time when the Church of the East convened a synod about the Virgin. It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And the numero itself is a kind of answer sent to the Nestorians. So it's likely, but I cannot say more than that. We can see that Jacob was very much interested in the Roman-Persian relations. He received those letters from the faithful of Arzon. He wrote about the war, the Persian-Roman war. He was well informed about, we can see that he was aware of Zoroastrianism and its traditions. And so he may have had an interest of what was going on the other side of the border. And of course, we always imagine borders as, closed and passable. And most of the time, it's not the case. We know of exchanges, and not only during periods of war. But of course, we have no means to be sure that it actually happened. But I cannot imagine why somebody would forge an introduction like that with so much detail.
Thank you. And my more general question is going right to what you're talking about with what I really appreciated at the beginning of your talk was this historical depiction of Jacob's letters that go to Persia, as well as the two homilies related to Amida. So these cities that were in that border region. And as far as I'm very invested in finding ways to contextualize Jacob's works historically, and especially homilies. And I'm wondering if, I was wondering where you would go with your talk, which homily you would work on next, in addition to your previous work. And I'm wondering how you would think of that. Is there a method that we could take to find homilies that will lend themselves to this interpretation? Or is this something that comes up just by coincidence? We find these common themes that work well together. How should we proceed in further trying to contextualize Jacob's homilies?
Probably by reading all of Jacob's homilies from the beginning to end, and probably several times, because I think that's how you can make links between them and try to see a broader picture. I hadn't realized that Mariological arguments were that important. Neither that it was in a memory about the Nativity and Mary, but we have information about the importance of the word, because of course it's Christ incarnated, so it's not surprising. But at the same time, I had never realized that before, reading a lot of Jacob's Mimre. So the new edition by Roger Acras is a wonderful opportunity to find new homilies that can shed some light on this historical context. The one I translated about the transformation of the church of St. Stephen in Amida into a fire temple is quite striking on that ground. You wouldn't have imagined something like that before this Mimro was published. So yeah, I'm sorry, I cannot really answer your question.
No, thank you.
Your question about that.
Thank you, Philip. Susan?
First, I want to join by thanking you, as others have, because this was a really wonderful, wonderful presentation, very rich with a deep knowledge and also shining lights of insight. And I just wanted to ask about one point. You did such a wonderful job with the proemia, which are a real fascination to me. And you did a wonderful job drawing out these different meanings of word and preaching and teaching kinds of authorities that he brought together at the moment of preaching them. One of the things that strikes me about these proemia, not only these proemia, but especially there, is his intersection with words of singing, which also, of course, go right through the Mimra in terms of when biblical figures speak, they often sing. And Jacob interchanges the vocabulary of singing and the vocabulary of speaking. And I wondered if you would comment on that.
Well, I think that it has to do with the way Jacob understands the liturgy with his physical dimension. I mentioned the fact that he works with the 10 senses, but that is really important because the 5 external senses, and especially the sense of hearing, opens to the inside senses. And so the sound, whether the sound of words or even more the sound of music, is not only something pleasant to the ear, but it's a way of engaging the whole body and mind and intellect. And at the same time, Jacob himself wrote Mimre, which were poetry. Yeah. And poetry means music of the words. And when he says, in one of the texts I quoted, that he asked God to give him words, sounds, and music, it's not just the hymns that were sung in the church, but his own Mimre, understood as a form of music, the music of words, with a rhyme and artistry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Any other questions? Muriel, thank you again for this wonderful talk. It was wonderful. We're all clapping for you. Thank you. Before we adjourn, I would like to remind you that our next speaker is Manolis Papoutskakis. He will deliver his paper entitled From Jacob of Serugh to Romanos on Wednesday, May 19th, 2021. And Rodrigue Constantine will deliver his second talk on John of Apamea tomorrow, April 22nd at 11 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. His second talk is entitled Psychology, Therapy, and Moral Growth. For more information, please visit thehiddenpearl.org. Thank you for joining us. We will see you either tomorrow, in May, or hopefully both. Have a wonderful evening.